Hey Geek family, we are back. This time we are finally going to check out the video for Does England Owe Reparations? And I'm Nathan.
I'm Rachel.
Trinity.
Troy. Jordan.
And this has pretty much been requested from the very get-go of the channel, so we've just been basically not able to sit down just because it's a longer video. But we're going to go ahead. We got time today, so we're going to sit down and check it out. But real quick before we do, thanks again, guys, for the support in the channel. And if you can, hit that like and subscribe, along with that little notification bell. Bing! And so yeah, this is going to be a little bit longer than normal video, but just bear with us. We're going to check this video out, and then we'll give a little talk after. So let's get to it.
I'm so wet. Look at that. People shape our world.
President, and gentlemen, ladies of the House, standing here with 8 minutes in my hands and this venerable and rather magnificent institution, I was going to assure you that I belong to the Henry VIII School of Public Speaking. That, as Henry VIII said to his wives, I shall not keep you long. But now finding myself the 7th speaker out of 8 in what must already seem a rather long evening to you, I rather feel like Henry VIII's last wife. I more or less know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure how to do it any differently. Perhaps what I should do is really try and pay attention to the arguments that were advanced by the opposition today. We had, for example, Sir Richard Ottaway suggesting, challenging the very idea that it could be argued that the economic situation of the colonies was actually worsened by the experience of British colonialism. Well, I stand to offer you the Indian example, Sir Richard. India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%.
Oh my God.
Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's industrial revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer. Went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%. Meanwhile, colonialists like Robert Clive bought their rotten boroughs in England on the proceeds of their loot in India, while taking the Hindi word loot into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. By the end of the 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression. And as has been pointed out, the wealthy Victorian British families that made their money out of the slave economy. 1/5 of the elites of the wealthy class in Britain in the 19th century owed their money to transporting 3 million Africans across the waters. And in fact, in 1833, when slavery was abolished, what happened was that a compensation of £20 million was paid, not as reparations to those who had lost their lives or who had suffered or been oppressed by slavery, but to those who had lost their property. I was struck by the fact that your Wi-Fi password of this union commemorates the name of Mr. Gladstone, the great liberal hero. Well, I'm sorry, his family was one of those who benefited from this compensation. Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill deliberately, as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision, he peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So all notions that the British were trying to do their colonial enterprise out of enlightened despotism to try and bring the benefits of colonialism and civilization to the benighted heathen. I'm sorry, Churchill's conduct in 43 is simply one example of many that gave a lie to this myth. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark. Let me take World War I as a very concrete example, since the first speaker, Mr. Lee, suggested these things couldn't be quantified. Well, let me quantify World War I for you. Again, I'm sorry, from an Indian perspective, others have spoken of other countries. 1/6 of all the British forces that fought in the war were Indian. 54,000 Indians actually lost their lives in that war. 65,000 were wounded, another 4,000 remained missing or in prison. Indian taxpayers had to cough up £100 million in that time's money. India supplied 70 million rounds of ammunition, 600,000 rifles and machine guns, 42 million garments were stitched and sent out of India, and 1.3 million Indian personnel served in this war. I know all this because, of course, the commemoration of the centenary has just taken place. But not just that, India had to supply 173,000 animals, 370 million tons of supplies, and in the end, the total value of everything that was taken out of India, India, by the way, suffering from recession at that time and poverty and hunger, was, in today's money, £8 billion. You want quantification? It's available. Second World War, it was even worse, 2.5 million Indians in uniform. I won't belabor the point, but of Britain's total war debt of £3 billion, in 1945 money, 1.25 billion was owed to India and never actually paid. Somebody mentioned Scotland. Well, the fact is that colonialism actually cemented your union with Scotland. You know, the Scots had actually tried to send colonies out before 1707. They'd all failed, I'm sorry to say. But then, of course, came union, and India was available, and there you had a disproportionate employment of Scots. I'm sorry, Mr. Mackenzie has to speak after me. Engaged in this colonial enterprise as soldiers, as merchants, as agents, as employees, and the earnings from India is what brought prosperity to Scotland, even pulled Scotland out of poverty. Now that India is no longer there, no wonder the bonds are loosening. Now, we've heard other arguments on this side. There's been a mention of the railways. Well, let me tell you, first of all, as my colleague, the Jamaican High Commissioner, has pointed out, railways and roads were really built to serve British interests and not those of the local people. But I might add that many countries have built railways and roads without having had to be colonized in order to do so. They were designed to carry raw materials from the hinterland into the ports to be shipped to Britain. And the fact is that the Indian or Jamaican or other colonial public, their needs were incidental. Transportation, there was no attempt made to match supply to demand for mass transport, none whatsoever. Instead, in fact, the Indian railways were built with massive incentives offered by Britain to British investors, guaranteed out of Indian taxes paid by Indians, with the result that you actually had 1 mile of Indian railway costing twice what it cost to build the same mile in Canada or Australia, because there was so much money being paid in extravagant returns. Britain made all the profits, controlled the technology, supplied all the equipment, and absolutely all these benefits came as private enterprise British private enterprise at public risk, Indian public risk. That was the railways as an accomplishment. We're hearing about aid. I think it was again Sir Richard Ottaway mentioned British aid to India. Well, let me just point out that British aid to India is about 0.4% of India's GDP. The government of India actually spends more on fertilizer subsidies, which might be an appropriate metaphor for that argument.
Oh,
If I may point out as well,
I like this guy.
if I may point out as well, that that as my fellow speakers from the proposition have pointed out, there have been incidents of racial violence, of loot, of massacres, of bloodshed, of transportation, in India's case, even of one of our last Mughal emperor. Yes, maybe today's Britons are not responsible for some of these depredations, but the same speakers have pointed with pride to their foreign aid. You're not responsible for the people starving in Somalia, but you give them aid. Surely the principle of reparations for the wrongs that have been done cannot be denied. It's been pointed out, for example, the dehumanization of Africans in the Caribbean, the massive psychological damage that has been done, the undermining of social traditions, of property rights, of the authority structures of these societies, all in the interests of British colonialism. And the fact remains that many of today's problems in these countries, including the persistence, in some cases the creation of racial and ethnic and religious tensions, were the direct result of the colonial experience. So there is a moral debt that needs to be paid. Someone challenged reparations elsewhere. Well, I'm sorry, Germany doesn't just give reparations to Israel. It also gave reparations to Poland. Perhaps some of the speakers here are too young to remember the dramatic picture of Chancellor Willy Brandt on his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970. And there are other examples. There is Italy's reparations to Libya. There's Japan's to Korea. Even Britain has paid reparations to the New Zealand Maoris. So it's not as if this is something unprecedented or unheard of that's going to somehow open some sort of nasty Pandora's box. No wonder Professor Lewis reminded us that he's from Texas. There's a wonderful expression in Texas that summarizes the arguments of the opposition: all hat and no cattle. Now,
Oh, she liked that too.
if I can just quickly look through the other
Look at her
notes I was
laughing
scribbling while they were speaking. There was reference to democracy and rule of law. Let me say with the greatest possible respect, it's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it. We were denied democracy, sir. We had to snatch it, seize it from you. With the greatest reluctance, it was conceded in India's case after 150 years of British rule, and that too with limited franchise. Yes, indeed, ma'am.
The opposition spoke quite highly of Greek and Athenian democracy on which the West should pride itself, and spoke of liberty and equality in that same name. The Athenian democracy was only functioning because of the slave society on which it was built. That's the nature of colonisation.
All right, I don't think that needs contradiction, not from me at any rate. but if I may just point out, I think the argument made by a couple of the speakers, the first speaker, Mr. Lee in particular, conceded all the evil atrocities of colonialism, but essentially suggested that reparations won't really help. They won't help the right people. They'll be used as a propaganda tool. They'll embolden people like Mr. Mugabe. It's always nice how in the old days, I'm sorry to say that the people of the Caribbean used to frighten their children into behaving and sleeping by saying Sir Francis Drake would come after them. That was a legacy of that. Now it's Mugabe will be there. So this is the new sort of Sir Francis Drake of our times. The fact is very simply, sir, that we are not talking about reparations as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for you to atone for the wrongs that have been done. And I am quite prepared to accept the proposition that you can't evaluate, put a monetary sum on the kinds of horrors people have suffered. Certainly no amount of money can expiate the loss of a loved one, as somebody pointed out there. You're not going to be able to figure out an exact amount. But the principle is what matters. The fact is that to speak blithely of sacrifices on both sides, as an analogy was used here, a burglar comes into your house, ransacks the place, stubs his toe, and you say, well, there was a sacrifice on both sides. That, I'm sorry to say, is not an acceptable argument. The truth is that we are not arguing specifically that vast sums of money need to be paid. The proposition before this House is the principle of owing reparations, not the fine points of how much is owed, to whom it should be paid. The question is there a debt? Does Britain owe reparations? As far as I'm concerned, the ability to acknowledge a wrong that has been done, to simply say sorry, will go a far, far, far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of aid. What is required, it seems to me, is accepting the principle that reparations are owed. Personally, I'd be quite happy if it was £1 a year for the next 200 years after the last 200 years of Britain and India. Thank you very much, Madam President.
He destroyed that.
Yeah, he did.
He shut them down.
He did.
Yeah, big time.
Yep.
That and the whole reparations thing too. We hear that from time to time here in the States as well about reparations, but we won't get into that. I liked his speech a lot. I liked everything he talked about. Everything he said was very well put.
Yeah.
The way he laid everything out, and even the part when he's just like, I can't say a monetary amount to put on. He's like, how about just and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, £1 a year.
For
The
200 years.
thing that touched base with me is when he was talking about just a sorry. That goes much further than any amount of money could possibly go. Just for somebody to say, you know what, we screwed up. We were stupid. We were wrong. Yeah. If somebody would just come forward and say that, the Indians, from my understanding from reading it, they did everything on their own. On their own. They didn't have any help. England left.
Yeah.
India has had to do everything on their own. Rebuild their country, rebuild their people, rebuild their way of life on their own. They didn't have any help. To me, in my personal opinion, England should be on their knees begging for forgiveness.
Well, yeah, I get, and as far as like that, England just gives them, signs everything back, gives everything back over to India, and yeah, if they just pull straight out and don't give any sort of assistance, like, hey, we've been here 150 years,
200.
take 200 years, taking all of the taking all your resources and stuff like that.
They
Hey, adios, have fun doing it yourself. Yeah, that's horrible.
That's crap.
Yeah, but
They
I guarantee they did that and they thought that them giving India back was their sorry or something like that.
See, the problem that
Probably.
the problem that I have with that,
Yeah.
though, this is coming from, the bottom of my heart. After reading some of the things that happened during the British occupation, because it wasn't a rule, it was an occupation. They were there illegally. They weren't supposed to be there. This wasn't their country. The things that they did to these people and the things that they took from them, and then they just up and leave and say, adios amigos, have fun. No, I'm sorry. You need to be on your knees begging for forgiveness, and that's it.
Was it anything like
Sounds like the
anything like giving natives
That's what I was just going to say.
blankets infested with?
The American government needs to apologize to the American Indians too. That's a whole nother rant I don't want to get into. But yeah.
Well, let me ask you this: Has the United States ever apologized for
No.
the way the Native
No.
Americans were treated?
No,
They
and they
need
still
to.
live. The
Native
Native Americans
Americans are
still
still
live
treated
on a
poorly.
reservation, and some of the reservations don't have electricity. Some of the reservations don't have water. Some of them are living in houses made out of cardboard.
Most of them have really low jobs.
In most
I don't want to talk
countries,
about it.
large countries, have very sordid pasts. Like we mentioned with the U.S. and the Native Americans, smallpox covered blankets given to them on purpose to kill them off so they could take the land and stuff like that. It's not good. It's as much as we like to think like USA, but we've got skeletons in our closet too, just like England's got skeletons in their closet. And granted, they've been around a lot longer than we have, so they've got a lot more. They've got more like a mansion size thing in there, but what?
You just said a mansion-sized thing, but in their butt.
No, in their butt.
In there, but oh gosh, I see what you're saying. Gee, what's on your mind?
In their butt.
In their butts.
I got butts in
So I have a question about the video.
All right.
Was he talking about, on one spot, was he talking about racism with African Americans? Like, they've been he said something about, like, emotionally traumatized from the past. He said something to that effect, like, African Americans have been a part of this sort of, like, he's talking about how they took over India, they did all these terrible things, and then he said you have to compensate for, like, Native or African Americans from the hate that they took. You can't deny it or whatever. Oh, I remember. He said he was talking about how you have to take responsibility. Like, he wanted Britain to take responsibility. You couldn't ignore what happened in the past. And I felt like he was saying that. He said something about African Americans. Like,
He was talking
doing the
about
same
how
thing.
England paid reparations for people being slaves, but they didn't pay the reparations to the slaves. They paid the reparations to the owners who
Yeah.
lost their
land.
property.
Yeah, that.
I thought he was saying, like, we need to, like, understand or something. I don't know.
Well, another thing too, he mentioned is that's 100% true about Winston Churchill saying that stuff.
If that is, that breaks
That's
my
pretty
heart
bad, man.
because
Yeah, like,
I
what
mean,
did he say?
Winston
When is
Churchill.
Gandhi gonna die? Is that what he said?
Winston
That's
Churchill
terrible.
was once my idol. I mean, I
Says
oh
a
my
lot about
god.
Rachel.
No,
I'm just
I
kidding,
mean,
I'm just kidding.
no, I'm saying because of what he did in World War II.
Well, that's the thing.
And
I
now
understand
hearing this?
him as the leader of the UK during that time and what was going on. They were by themselves for a good period of time.
Yeah, 'cause we
and
wouldn't do it
trying
again.
to get as much resources as he can to battle Nazis. But at the same time, you don't starve
No,
out a whole nation
and that just
for that. You can there's a middle
He didn't-
ground there. You
he
can
didn't- I get it. I get it.
get it. Do
you
get it?
sure?
Yeah, I get it, dude.
So.
Get it, did.
Alright, well, I'll tell you what, it was a very interesting video. It did give a lot of good information. A lot of that stuff we didn't know here, I know, ourselves, especially the stuff about Winston Churchill. And the way you kind of look at it, you're like, part of me wants to go watch the other video. Like, we're not
does,
going
it
to
does
right
me
now.
too.
I'm just curious at what the opposition to what
He said.
How can he
What
have?
he-
How can he have an opposition though? That's what I don't
I
understand.
don't
Well,
understand what's so
it's
bad
just
about
like-
saying sorry.
there's nothing bad about
Exactly.
there's nothing bad about that, but his whole
The thing is, like, it happened in the past. Why can't you know?
Well,
They
I
just need to
understand
stand
that.
too much
I do.
pride.
Hey,
They just need to put
Brent-
their pride aside. It
Listen,
just-
all
I'm
yellow,
not
sorry.
arguing with you guys.
I'm sorry.
Britain's basically
No.
saying that Britain's basically like they think that they're above and they think that they don't have to apologize for something they did in the past.
Well, we don't know if that's what he's going to say. I don't know.
But what I'm saying is,
Wait,
and
George
I
never
understand what you're saying is that
You never said anything.
I never got to say anything.
Yeah,
No.
you never get to say anything.
Let him
what
say-
were
let
you
him say it.
what were you gonna
No,
say?
I'm
No,
good.
no, no. Tell
I
me what were you
didn't
gonna
forgot.
say?
I didn't forget.
You forgot. What I want to
Forget all the
say
time.
is that how can somebody even have a retort to that? In all honesty,
You won't. You could. I don't think you can have a retort to the part when he's saying, like, how about just a sorry or
Right.
or what you did to the land, all that. You can't really have a retort to that. His retort is probably the whole thing of, like, I would assume was more of, like, monetarily why they don't. Maybe. Bless you.
sorry. Thank you.
That I can think of. I'm not 100% sure. Like I said, I would like to go listen to it and watch it. We won't do a video on the opposition side, but I'm very curious at what they like to say.
I just don't understand how he can even have a retort for saying, "I'm sorry." I mean, you did this to these people. You occupied their country.
It literally takes
He
5
did it.
seconds to say I'm sorry.
Country.
Well,
That's
but what I'm
probably
saying.
his whole thing
It
is
could
that,
be.
like, their current time, Britain, like, their current Britain did not do anything. So he's probably saying, like, hey, it was in the past. Let bygones be bygones.
Yeah, but
That's-
The same queen that's on the
Hang on.
throne now was also on the throne when this happened.
No, she wasn't queen.
She was queen when they
Another
left.
thing is that
We-
Germany did the same thing with the Jews when they murdered a crap ton of them.
No,
but-
she wasn't.
But they're paying off that right now. But
Right.
Britain doesn't want to for some reason. It's like why can't you be as mature as Germany and just pay off your debt?
But
I'm sorry.
okay, wait, but what you said about the royal family, the person who, she was not on the throne, but she was a princess when it happened. She was married to the nephew of the man who gave back India. As far as I'm concerned, in 1947, they handed over India back to the Indians. In my personal opinion, yes, she needs to be the one that says she's sorry. Because she
Well, I don't think
is,
there's anything wrong with that.
because she's the highest one. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, she was around during all. I get what you're saying. Like, she wasn't in charge, but she was around during that time.
Right. So I mean,
Yeah.
there is somebody who is there on the throne right now during this was happening. So in my opinion, she needs to be the one that says she's sorry. Heck, Prince Philip needs to be the one that says he's sorry too, because it was his stupid uncle that was over there. Sorry.
You should go tell him.
Rachel knows a lot of the history, especially if it has anything to do with the royal family from Britain. Rachel knows about it.
Shut up.
But yeah, thank you guys for suggesting that. Once again, we're sorry it took so long to get to it. It was just a longer video, so we wanted to make sure we had time to sit down and really watch it and talk about it. Yeah, let us know in the comments down below or on our Twitter and Instagram what your guys' thought are of this of this video of his speech, and if you guys have actually watched any of the opposition's response to his to what he said. So yeah, once again, thank you guys again so much for all your love and support on the channel. Love y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Why are they saying Britain owes him something?
We'll find out.
Because,
We'll find out right here. All right,
Rachel's
everybody
already
ready?
read the synopsis.
No, I haven't. I just know the history.
Well, none of this is going in, so I'm not.
I don't care. I still want my money.
Cut this out, because everybody's gonna call me retarded again. They always call me dumb.